I would like to welcome everyone to the first out of three guest lectures brought to you by the Institut für Friedenssicherungsrecht und Humanitäres Völkerrecht at the University of Bochum and from the Network on Humanitarian Action. My name is Will Wright, and I'm a research associate at the EFFO and also the communications and administrative manager of the Network on Humanitarian Action. And today we will, I'm going to hand over the floor to the executive director of the EFFO to welcome everyone and to introduce our guest of honor, former Commissioner Christos Stylianides. So Pierre, I will hand the floor over to you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. I know it's been your last day of class, and I know the weather is extremely good. So we appreciate everyone who takes an interest in the event. It's really, I think, quite a special event because the guest that you will see today is really an outstanding individual in the field of humanitarian action. So I'm very happy to introduce him, Christos Stylianides. And as people who are famous, they don't need long introductions. We agreed that I will keep my introduction short because most people in the humanitarian sector know him anyway. So I'll only say maybe 3 or 4 things. One is the most recent thing to know about Christos is that he has now a new role as EU Special Envoy for the promotion of freedom of religion or belief outside of the EU. And as you can tell already from that title, that's a very interesting mandate, not strictly speaking related to what we talked about today, but very interesting anyway, a very interesting task. But of course, what qualifies him most to speak here in front of young students who strive to be humanitarians or are in the process of becoming humanitarians is, of course, the fact that he was the European Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Management. Right? In the previous commission between 2014 and 2019, that was when his mandate still included the words humanitarian aid. Now it doesn't anymore. His successor is not called this anymore. So he was the European Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Management from 2014 to 19. And also interestingly enough, before he was also the EU's Ebola coordinator under the Juncker Commission, which I think is also something in particular, if you think about the current COVID crisis, which makes him an interesting speaker. 2 more things maybe before he joined the European level, if you like. He was also a very successful politician in Cyprus, where he was a member of the Cyprus House of Representatives, before he then became a member to the European Parliament. And lastly, but importantly for us, of course, within NOHA, he's not only a visiting professor at the London School of Economics and a professor in Nicosia in Cyprus, he is also a visiting professor on a permanent basis for Ruhr University Bochum, which is, of course, one of their partner universities from NOHA. So that's our connection to him. I've had the pleasure to meet him on many occasions, and I'm very sure he will give you a very interesting talk. And the floor is all yours, Christos.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much, Pierre, for your kind words. Yes, student, as you know, Pierre is my good friend, and this is he's really biased, and this is why he was so nice about my CV. Okay, you know that in similar occasions, always the speaker has this privilege through nice and kind words about his or her career. Okay. Today, I would like to focus on my positive obsession, education emergencies, and this is why I'm ready to start our communication, dear students, without this typical speech. I think it's really better to start with some questions, Q&A, and of course, I'm ready to continue after the initial questions to try to reply your questions why not even through your criticism about our activities in humanitarian field? My dear friend there, I'm here.
Great, so then we can get started. So we have a couple of questions. So we'll do this sort of like an interview, and then afterwards, hopefully after about 45 minutes, we can open it up to all of the other viewers for their questions as well. So to start off, Christos, in your time as commissioner, you helped bring education and emergencies to the forefront of Europe's policy priorities in humanitarian action. What was your thinking behind this, and why do you think that education and emergencies is such a critical aspect of humanitarian response?
Yes, indeed. Education and emergencies in humanitarian response, it was one of my most important priorities during my mandate as European Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Management between 2014 and 2019. Just for your information, when I started my mandate, November 2014, early 2015, only 1% of our humanitarian budget went to education in emergency. At the end of my mandate, 2019, we managed to invest, to increase our budget to 10%. So 10 times more than 4 years ago. Why this? And I think this is your question, my dear friend. Give me the chance to explain this 10 times increase through a real true story, which it was a turning point in my philosophical approach concerning humanitarian and development aid, especially in education field. One of my first critical and very challenging field trip was in Lebanon, early 2015. I know the region because I'm coming of the region. As Diana already said, I'm coming from Cyprus. I know the really unique check and balances of the political system of Lebanon. And of course, I knew and I had many experiences before war in Syria about the connection and the relationship between Syria and Lebanon and the whole region, more or less. I remember this is my attitude during my field trips. I asked my security people, and we went unofficial walks and strolls in the village in Bekaa Valley in order to see behind the scene what was happening. And there I realized from the beginning of my work that many of the radical groups at that time, they tried to recruit many of the teenagers to be members of the radical groups and to, of course, inject them through this hate approach regarding different religions. So, from the first day of my visit, of my trip, I realized that here is something very dangerous and we have to deal without hesitation and we have to take urgent measures against this phenomenon. In the second day, when I visited many camps and some families in some villages in the Ga Valley with a real war conditions and challenges. I visited many families and I provided as commissioner with my team food, all these humanitarian assistance. I remember clothes, everything. I met a mother, single mother with 6 children, who they survived of the war zones in Syria close to Damascus, and they just arrived in the Ga Valley, and they were under real difficult situation, and I provided food for them, and I believe that this is very important for them, and I was very proud because European Union and me as commissioner in my team, we managed to provide food in shelter in order to give to this family and many others, and to be in safe part of Lebanon. When after my visit and when I tried to leave, the single mother told me, we had translator, of course, thank you, Commissioner, for the food, for the water, and of course for the shelter. But my children need something more, need something more food, something more shelter. They need a future. And as I know, they need education. I never forget her words. The look in her eyes, her passion to see her children, 6 children, to be in education process. And for me, because of my personal experience also in Cyprus, it's a different story, and it was a turning point in my approach regarding humanitarian aid, that we need to start our humanitarian assistance in education, not after 2-3 years when development aid could engage in this educational process, but we have to start from a day one. Otherwise, it's impossible to avert lost generation. And because, as I said, humanitarian crisis lasts much longer, several years on average. We cannot wait until the emergency is over to provide education through development aid. So it's little bit illusion to believe that education is only part of the development aid. And I had this discussion during my mandate with many people, even in my DG at that time. And I think after my mandate, I convinced a lot of people about this necessity to start education from the day one. Otherwise, it's impossible to deal with this problem and to give future to the children. Otherwise, unfortunately, we will see exploitation of the children, labor exploitation, sexual exploitation, and also education, especially in these conditions, war conditions, is completely shield against radicalization, against forced recruitment. I have to stop. I know that we have a limited time.
Yeah, so I think one of the points you just sort of touched on, I'd like to maybe explore that a little bit more. So, some would criticize this prioritization or this focus on education in emergencies by highlighting that it's not necessarily life-saving. It's not necessarily something that humanitarians should be doing, or it represents sort of a mission creep for humanitarians to take on more and more beyond what's their traditional purview would be. And so what are your thoughts on this idea, this criticism that education in emergencies represents mission creep?
I talk a lot during my mandate, especially regarding this criticism. And of course, I was, and I'm open to discuss this issue. Where is the starting point of education in development phase, in development aid, and where is the last point about education and access? But I strongly believe, and I saw this during my many visits in Mosul, in Boko Haram area and everywhere, that one day away from education means really, as I said, increased risk of sexual or labor exploitation, forced recruitment, forced marriage, and radicalization. I saw this about forced marriage in northern, eastern Nigeria, in area in which Boko Haram, unfortunately, even now has a very dominated role. And the only way to see, especially girls, to be protected by forced marriage is the possibility to be exposed. So it's we have to go beyond this by book approach that development of humanitarian aid is two different completely phases and is two different completely subjects. No, it's really connected. Is we can see a lot of overlapping in many of our activities, and this is why we have to accept that this is the hard reality on the ground, and we have to find where is the productive and very important nexus between humanitarian and development. So education, I think, is the most important example about this nexus between humanitarian and development. And this is why we have to start from the day one. Otherwise, if a child, 12 years old, in the Gah Valley, in Iraq, in Myanmar, in everywhere, in Africa, he or she will lose 2 or 3 years out of school, it's very difficult to convince her or him to go back, because he lost the process. He lost this step-by-step educational procedure. And it's very difficult to understand. So we have to realize that the educational emergency, even out of the typical education system, unofficial education is so important because it's the only connection from the for the children to be in constant contact with a sort of educational process. I'm not naive. I know where that maybe we will lose a lot of parts of this educational process, but at least we need a touch with education. And this is why during my mandate, I decided to be so aggressive regarding education emergencies. And this is why I started from 1% to 10%, gradually, of course. And At the same time, here will be students. In the end of our mandate, we realized that even this 10% increase in education, we didn't recognize some weaknesses in other parts of the humanitarian action. Why? Because of this pressure, our humanitarian partners and our donors, they found, because they adopted the idea and they found innovative ways in order to continue their action at the same high level with maybe sometimes less money. So this is, I think, it's part of the practical approach regarding humanitarian aid. The hard reality is so important, and because humanitarian action during emergencies is going beyond these typical processes. So this is the role of the humanitarian action, to adapt ourselves on the ground in the hard reality, and to adapt also some of our funding in order to be close to the hard reality. And through my experience, I realized that education in this emergency situation is literally life-saving, because the teenagers in the Gaza Valley in 2015 and 2016, or in Haleti or in Mosul, when they had any contact with education, with teachers, with some process in education, it was difficult to meet people from radical groups. It was difficult for them to decide to go through forced recruitment, even for $100 per year. In Somalia, Al-Shabaab, they recruited teenagers with $100 per year. You can imagine. If these teenagers, 16 years old, 17 years old, they have any contact with education, definitely they were under coaching against this type of radicalization, against this attitude, because they well know that they have future. And I met many people, refugees and others from Syria and so on, in Jordan, with some scholarship, even in Portugal, even in Greece. And I realized when they had contact with education, they had this vision, they have this dream. We are going to the university. We are going beyond this war zone. We have to survive in order to see ourselves far away from here, just to survive and to see our future through universities, through different technical education and so on. So it's part of the survival process, the education in emergency. And this is why I insist on this, and I insist on it.
So you came back to the point a little bit as to how much education in emergencies has been prioritized since you first entered into position as commissioner, and that was also sort of underscored by the discussions on education in emergencies at the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016 as well. So I think the humanitarian sector has definitely come a long way from where we maybe were 10 years ago or 20 years ago in our approach to education in emergencies. But what do you think are right now the current strengths and weaknesses in education in emergencies that you can observe? And where do you think humanitarian organizations get education in emergencies right, or where do you think that things could be a little bit better? think we're having some technical difficulties.
Can you hear me?
Christos, I think your camera is off.
Now, I think you have to make the same.
Yeah, one moment.
Yes, please.
I think it should work now.
Okay. Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, but this is the new state of play about teleconference and so on. First of all, I can only see advantage through education emergencies. At the same time, of course, there are a lot of places where the situation on the ground is very difficult. Educational establishments and students have increasingly become a deliberate target of violent attacks, notably in the Sahel region. And I strongly believe that we have to find ways in order to see how we can overcome these weaknesses. No doubt that not only during the COVID-19 crisis, but even before, we challenge a lot of problems, especially about internet, about Wi-Fi. And many of our humanitarian partners on the ground, NGOs and UN agencies, regardless of their true intention, genuine intention to reach children even far away from cities and towns, and it was difficult because of this problem of internet, Wi-Fi, and so on. So this is a real weakness. At the same time, don't underestimate some traditional habits and behaviors in some areas against education, in particular for girls. So for me, always the real challenge about girls' education remains a real priority, because it's the only way, especially in Sahel region, to see even a sort of family strategy about newborns. You know that in Africa there is a prediction that in 2050 we will see a double population. Definitely, we are not against newborns, but at the same time, a lot of these newborns, unfortunately, came because of a forced marriage and sexual abuse. So it's one of the biggest weaknesses to see and to reach girls during teenager period in order to give them future and to understand that they have a lot of opportunities through education, instead to be only in their villages just to be mothers for 10, 15 boys and girls. So I focus on this in order to understand and to realize our students that our everyday lives in Europe is completely different than what they suffer and what they live in some areas. And I once again insist on Sahel region because maybe it's one of the poorest regions in the world.
Okay, so what specific challenges have you seen that humanitarians face in trying to address education emergencies in the current crises around the world? You talked about a few of them in your experience, but what are specifically the challenges that you've observed?
Yeah, I already mentioned the security challenges on the ground. And I said that in some areas, in Sahel, a lot of students have increasingly become a deliberate target of violent attacks. Boko Haram is a typical example. And also during the Syrian crisis, we experience also a lot of security challenges on the ground. However, another real example, as I said, is a digital and remote solution. These are strongly needed in humanitarian settings and definitely have helped a lot of children already. But access to the necessary means is not equal, including on IT equipment and internet connection, as I already emphasized on this. And this became more and more clear during our time, during pandemic time. The UN estimates that almost 24 million children and young people in humanitarian crisis situations are at risk of not returning to school due to COVID-19. 24 million. Girls are even at a higher risk, as not attending school in many cases leads to early and forced marriage. So the current figure about children who are out of school is more or less 120 million. And during pandemic, almost 24 million children and young people, they are at risk of not returning to school due to COVID. So I think it's a real challenge for the humanity. It's a real challenge, especially for our developed world, the European Union, because we are the biggest humanitarian donor in the world. We are proud of this, but we have to do a lot in order to reach and to meet the needs on the ground, and to meet at least modest expectations regarding our humanitarian activities.
So what specific advantages and opportunities do you see in trying to address the educational needs of those affected by crisis?
Look, as I said, in 2015, the European Union's humanitarian budget for education emergency was 10 million euros. Only 10 million. After my decision to multiply this assistance, and of course, my successor, Commissioner Lenarčič, continue this commitment, and this is very important. So it's not only my personal obsession, but because of the results, because of the outcome of this policy, my successor already continued this very important policy. And so the European Union has allocated 600 million for education emergencies between 2015 and 2020, from 10 million to 600 million. Can you imagine the amount? And through this amount, we helped over 9.5 million children in 60 countries, 60. And as I said many times, I'm extremely proud as a European for this globally leading role. What is more? We create a positive momentum for change. For me, it was an obsession, not because we are leading by example, but because through our turning point decision, many others of the humanitarian donor community, they decided to increase their budget for education needs. So we saw in the last 5-6 years that education and literacy became a priority in the humanitarian donors community. But at the same time, this new approach gave us more opportunities in order to find innovative ways to connect the humanitarian part of education with the development part of education. And it was very critical because through this new budget, we found this way, and you can see a child who was benefited by humanitarian assistance where she was 14 years old, and now some of them, they are students at the university. So this is the true result. This is what I can describe as a result-oriented policy. Some of our children, some refugees, some even girls who suffer by sexual abuse, they started through humanitarian emergency education, even with digital education, and now they manage to be students in medical schools, in law schools, in business schools, and everywhere. For me, this is a miracle. And this is why I feel so proud because of this point. And because I met many of the children. And if you see their eyes, and if you see their passion and their dedication about education, you can understand why education is a shield, why education is the only way for a future for the children, especially in crisis zone. And I'm very happy because also the new commissioner for international partnership, Mrs. Urpilainen, has publicly committed to allocate 10% of the European Union's development assistance to education. So this is very important because we are leading by example as European Union as a whole, not only humanitarian commissioners, but also development commissioners. My dear friend, this is the reality in politics. It's not easy to change a business as usual approach. When I decided and I started to convince even the people inside the institution, even at the European Parliament, many of them, they were so committed and so hostages because of this approach. Education is a development aid path. It's not humanitarian. But when they realize that we have to fulfill the gap on the ground in the crisis zone, otherwise we cannot offer even development education because if the children, they will lose 3-4 years out of school, it's impossible to go back. So I think now we are in a very efficient and effective way in order to see education as the unique and special tool to protect children in crisis zone.
Maybe to get a bit more specific. So I think this is my last question. So if anyone from the audience has any questions, please feel free to write them in the question and answer chat. But you know, you've talked about several crises tonight that you've had experience with, and given the number of crises around the world at the moment, is there a specific crisis or a crisis response that you can point to and really say, oh, here is an example of education in emergencies being done right? Or do you think there's a crisis that maybe concerns you more than others in its sort of implications for continuing education for those affected by the crisis?
Look, during my mandate, because of the Syrian crisis and because of a lot of refugees and migrants in Turkey due to Syrian crisis, we focus on Turkey and we focus on education and literacy in many areas in Turkey. I can mention the highly successful conditional cash for education program that the European Union supports and invests in Turkey. We started it years ago. We started in 2016. And as I saw the figures, in 2021, 21st, we can support 700,000 refugee children to continue their education until the next year. I witnessed myself this great work because of this scheme, conditional cash. What do we mean for this title, conditional cash? In Turkey, we started also very special humanitarian assistance through cash and voucher. We provided to each family of refugees with around 300-400 euros per month for their basic needs. At the same time, in order to avoid labor recruitment, we gave the ability to any family to send their children to the school through conditional cash. And it was really very important because we saw the numbers to increase immediately after this conditional cash scheme. Because we gave them motivation to the families to see their children to go to school. And of course, in my many visits in Turkey, I realized in many families that the new climate, even in the refugee camps, it was completely different after when the children went to school and came back from the children to their homes with completely different feelings of new identity, feelings of new knowledge, feelings of real future out there. So don't underestimate the psychological support of the school on the ground, especially in this very tragic and challenging condition for refugees and migrants. And this is why I'm really very proud of this conditional cash in Turkey. Also, I can say a lot of examples about the Afghan refugees in Iran. I visited many Afghan refugees in Iran. I visited twice Iran. And also the South Sudanese in Sudan and Uganda. And no doubt that the examples are many about good examples of the ground. Of course, as I said, I'm really worried about the security challenges posed by groups such as Boko Haram in Nigeria, that they do not hesitate to invade school and kidnap students. You know, this very famous story about the girls. But I strongly believe that if we focus through new amount on the digital education and to reduce this gap of digital education, we will see definitely more children who enter in this very fascinated story of educational process, and we will see a lot of children who understand their skills, to understand that they have the skills in order to see their future with more promises and more confidence. This is the most important thing. As I said many times, we have to be ready at any time to adapt ourselves to find more innovative and inclusive services. And when I mention inclusive, I insist on education for them, because I strongly believe that in some areas, especially in Africa, there is a completely unfair situation against them. And especially in Africa, because of the many variety traditional approaches, the women is the most important pillar regarding social cohesion and regarding family cohesion. And I believe that only through our support in education and exercise, we can give to the girls the ability to remain the most important pillar and to see through new partnerships, Africa to be self-reliant, to realize their opportunities, to realize that they could be equal for all other continents in the world.
Thank you. So we already have a couple of questions. The first one is the problem with mission creep is the ever-extending mandate of humanitarian action. With COVID, millions of children are out of school and at risk of not returning in conflict-affected or fragile states. Humanitarian actors cannot provide education in emergencies for all, especially in light of a heightened focus on health and water and sanitation. Where should we draw the line? How can buy-in from development actors in these difficult contexts be improved? And what incentives could be given to improve coordination along the nexus?
It's really very interesting questions, but I can say a few words about this, but definitely it's part of our heart, I think, speech about Nexus humanitarian development aid. But just few words. No doubt that until now, we didn't find these innovative ways in order to see this so-called nexus, collaboration between humanitarian and development actors on the ground to be really effective and efficient. But especially in education, as I mentioned, I think it's a true example that we can see this nexus, which will be happen even eventually, because I remember my visit in Mosul, and there we utilize humanitarian aid as a tool for reconciliation of a different religious and ethnic groups. Because Mosul is a real mosaic of a different religious and ethnic groups. And in my first visit after liberation, I saw that some of the teachers who were under ISIS pressure and, of course, imposing measures, they taught the hate among different religions. In the same school, we saw same teachers, same children to be really witness of the new approach regarding reconciliation, to be together. And it was a miracle for me to see 3 months ago, completely different climate in the schools in Mosul, and 3 months after, all children to be together, Muslims, Christians, Yazidis, Turkmen. And also this climate in the hospitals, Muslim doctor with Christian nurse and Turkmen patient. So I strongly believe that, I'm going back to education. In education, we can see this step-by-step nexus between humanitarian and development. Because when we provided real assistance, even with unofficial schools in the Ga Valley, in order to keep in touch with children in the primary school, and then the majority of them, they can go to the Lebanese educational system in the secondary school in order to continue their education. It's the real example about the necessity of this nexus between education emergency and development education under the national system. And of course, you can see also for many teenagers in many areas, even in Africa, where the teenagers, they keep in touch with education process, even unofficially, but they keep in touch, and then they can go through even examination and so on in some universities, with online education and so on. So we have a lot of examples about the nexus. It's something which is working on the ground, but definitely we need to do more in order to put this nexus in a very effective framework. And this, of course, is not something which could be something as a magic framework for all different cases in a different crisis. No, we have to adjust this framework for a specific country, for a specific area, even for a specific region in the same country.
Thank you. So the next question is, how can continuous education be ensured in emergency situations where schools are constantly under attack, as is the case of the conflict in the English-speaking regions of Cameroon, amongst others?
Definitely it's difficult. And I believe that online education is an alternative way to keep education in touch with the children, but definitely through my experience and through many assessments and through many research, the schoolyard, the school conditions are the best, especially for the primary and the secondary school. But in Cameroon or in other African countries, when we cannot see the children to be in real schools, in this very beautiful school climate environment, we have to find innovative ways to provide to them online. As I said, a lot of challenge because in many areas, unfortunately, they don't have internet. In many areas, they don't have access even to a computer. And even you can see 2, 3 computers, laptops in the whole village. So this is the real challenge. And this is why I strongly believe, and through my experience, that we have to adapt ourselves to local humanitarian workers in order to understand the hard reality in a very different regions, villages, and areas. So here I can refer and I can mention that, and this is why the local humanitarian workers and local NGOs are so important, not only for the humanitarian aid alone, not only for the development aid similarly, but also for this very important nexus between humanitarian and development. And of course, in sometimes here we need to think out of the box in order to find solutions on the ground. This is why I believe that the humanitarian workers and the humanitarian organizations, they need experience on the ground in order to understand the whole humanitarian process. Otherwise, from our offices in Brussels, in Bochum, in Berlin, in London, I think we just go through, we just go by book, but in the majority of the cases, we are far away from the hard reality. And we will not see results of the plan. We just say kind words, very good expressions, where are the results? So my advice, because even myself in my age, I'm already 60, 62, I got a lot, I learned a lot because of my visit on the ground. I cannot realize humanitarian actors, humanitarian commissioners from our offices in Europe. We have to go there on the ground and to see the problems, to see the needs on the ground in order to find these really innovative ways to find solutions, to find results.
Thank you. So that's it with the questions from the audience so far. I would invite everyone to send some more questions. In the meantime, I may use the opportunity and ask another question from my side. So we've talked a lot, I feel like, about the perspective of humanitarian organizations, and from our side, where do you maybe see hurdles or challenges for those seeking education in emergency situations? I mean, I can imagine you've talked about several examples of people coming from education and emergencies backgrounds that have then gone and studied at universities in Europe. But I would imagine that transition is quite difficult from secondary education to university. So where do you think there's room for improvement there?
It's really very, very critical question because we face a lot of similar problems as you already mentioned. For example, now in Syria, in Iraq, and in Lebanon, many children, they follow a secondary school schedule program, and they finish in a very high level the secondary school program, but because of a lot of obstacles, they cannot go through the national system in Lebanon in order to be students in in Lebanon universities, state universities. So it's a critical challenge for the humanitarian community to find this way to see refugees and migrant children to have a little bit different way entering at the universities than the students with national identity, for example, because they didn't have the ability to follow the national program of education. So I think it's a good idea to negotiate with some host countries to give the ability for a different examination, maybe, or a different skills level for entering at the university. We saw this in Turkey, in Lebanon, even in Iraq, and in some universities with in between status, state university with private approach. We saw many refugee children to be students without the typical way of the students through national scheme. And after 2 years, many professors, and I know this because of my new job as a visiting professor, that many of the refugee children, they were excellent students regardless of their weaknesses during their secondary school program. So everyone could improve himself even with some weaknesses from the past. So we have to give the opportunities, and we have to find the ways to connect this unofficial way education process in parallel way with the national scheme for the students with national identity. For example, I remember I visited some students with scholarship in Lisbon, and this is another example regarding nexus between humanitarian and development aid. Some of them, they were at the secondary schools in Turkey, and then they managed to take a scholarship in some universities in Lisbon. And after the first year, they managed to be in the first 10% of the students' performance. So anyone can improve himself in order to continue his education, regardless of some weaknesses during primary or secondary. And as I know, many of our humanitarian partners, organizations, and NGOs, they put pressure on some governments in order to realize this parallel way of entering at the university, because it's also very helpful for their societies to inject their societies with refugee children. I know this from Greece. Many times you can see, not only now, but even years ago with Albanian teenagers, they were the first student in the class. Yes. So I strongly believe that we can give more opportunities to the refugee children without, of course, to marginalize the students through national schemes and people. And we can find ways in order to be in a parallel way and to give this opportunity. It's not fair And it's our moral duty to give this opportunity to the refugees.
Okay, I would just have one last question, and it's maybe a slightly selfish one or a little self-reflective. Do you see any ways that universities, and especially universities working or programs working in graduate education like NOHA, the master's program like NOHA, can contribute to education in emergencies and the agenda around it? Where do you see, sort of synergies in that area?
I definitely believe that this master program will be an excellent tool to give the ability to some of our students to make research about all these aspects of the education emergencies on the ground. And I'm sure that through this new type of research, we can find more ways in order to improve ourselves. Because our students in NOHA, first of all, they have this dedication to deal with the humanitarian problems. They have this sensitivity to understand in some extent, not so obvious humanitarian problems. So I think they have the background in order to make this research and to give us more figures and more proposals to improve our humanitarian actions in education. Because regardless of the budget, of course, it is an infrastructure in order to provide education. But a lot of topics around this project, a lot of different way of thinking. So we need to sit together through scientific approach, research, and maybe to standardize some aspects of our humanitarian action on the ground in order to be more efficient. We need to utilize our NOHA master students to give us their knowledge, their sensitivity, and their education in humanitarian field.
And thank you very much. I think that's it for the questions, so we can get done a little bit early today, especially since we currently have, I think, Cyprus weather here in Germany at the moment, so it's quite warm, and I'm sure it's warm where you are as well. So next,
I'm in Brussels. Brussels, and it is quite warm, fortunately.
So I would like to thank you again and thank Professor Thielberger as well for introducing us today. We will have our next guest lecture next week at the same time, and it will focus on the nexus between humanitarian action and development. So a link for that will be posted online tomorrow, and we'll go around to all of the students and faculty tomorrow. So hopefully then we'll have a few more people who can join us. And I'm definitely very much looking forward to our conversation next week.
Thank you so much. See you soon. See you in a week.
See you then.
Good night from Brussels. Good night.